Hello everyone. Thank you for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. Dieu Han, a pitiable 17-year-old girl, held her baby in her arms, her eyes filled with fear, tears streaming down her pale face. Her husband, after having an affair with another woman, had beaten her and thrown her out of the house. On the uneven red dirt road, she wore a brown coat and wrapped herself in a red shawl, clutching her 6-month-old child tightly. She walked hurriedly, her eyes filled with terror, her face exhausted and drained. Her dazed eyes stared ahead as a deserted shack appeared in the distance. She approached, slipped through the worn-out wooden door, and carefully placed her child in a corner. Brushing back her sweat-drenched hair, she opened her bag. Inside was only a hastily thrown pack of instant noodles. She tore open the package, breaking off small pieces and chewing slowly, eating while watching her little one squirm in her arms. The baby started to cry. Dieu Han quickly pulled down her blouse to nurse, but her meager milk was not enough to soothe the child. Before she could rest, a man entered, his face full of irritation. He looked around, spotted Dieu Han and the baby, and immediately shouted, "What are you doing in my house? Get out!" Startled, she clutched her baby tightly, her eyes pleading, "Please, just for one night. I have nowhere else to go." The man showed no sympathy. He yanked her basket away and threw it outside. The pack of noodles tumbled to the ground, her belongings scattered. With no other choice, Dieu Han picked up her baby and ran, tears streaming down her face. Dieu Han held her baby tightly against her chest, dragging her weary steps along the dusty red dirt road. Her old, worn-out sandals were caked in dust, each step feeling like she was dragging the weight of despair itself. Her stomach growled with hunger, her body weak and drained. She opened her last packet of instant noodles, breaking it into small pieces and chewing dryly. The baby wailed loudly from hunger. She hurriedly pulled down her blouse to nurse, but only a few meager drops of milk came out. The infant sucked desperately, but there was little to take in. The tiny face wrinkled with distress, small hands flailing helplessly in the air. Dieu Han held her child even closer, gently trying to soothe the baby, but inside her heart was breaking. Ahead, a wooden house stood with light glowing faintly through the window. Summoning all her courage, she stepped forward and knocked on the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, sister. Let my baby and me stay just for one night." The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman with a frown. She looked Dieu Han up and down before shaking her head coldly. "My house is not a shelter for strangers. Go away." Before Dieu Han could say another word, the door slammed shut in her face. She bit her lip hard, swallowing her pain. Turning away, she wiped the tears from her eyes and kept walking. She approached another house, knocking hesitantly, clinging to a fragile sliver of hope. This time, a different woman answered, her expression wary. Dieu Han pleaded desperately, "Please, just one night. We'll leave first thing in the morning." The woman frowned, glancing at the baby in Dieu Han's arms, then waved her away. "No, leave now. My house is not a charity." With that, she slammed the door shut, leaving Dieu Han frozen in place. She hugged her child even tighter, lowered her head, and quietly walked away. Her legs trembled, her breathing was labored, but she had no choice but to keep moving. No one would help her. No one would take her in. All she had left was the road ahead, though she had no idea where it would lead. Dieu Han held her child tightly against her chest, her steps slow and heavy on the rugged dirt road. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, the sound of leaves whispering in the stillness of the night. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the air. A weak, trembling cry, barely audible over the wind. She stopped, straining her ears to listen. The cry was not loud, but it carried fear and distress. Looking ahead, she spotted a young boy sprawled on the ground, his electric scooter lying on its side nearby. Her heart pounded as she rushed over, carefully placing her child down before kneeling beside the boy. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, gently shaking him. The boy whimpered, his eyes red and filled with tears streaming down his young face. It hurts, my leg hurts," he sobbed. Dieu Han glanced down and saw his scraped knees and elbows, blood seeping through the dirt on his skin. Without hesitation, she quickly plucked some nearby leaves, chewed them into a paste, and carefully applied it to his wounds to stop the bleeding. "Shoo, it's okay. I'll help you," she soothed him, her voice calm and reassuring. The boy bit his lip, trying to suppress his cries, his small hands clutching the fabric of her shirt as if seeking safety. With no bandages available, Dieu Han removed her hat, tore a piece of cloth from it, and gently wrapped his injured arm with great care. "There, it's all better now," she said softly, lifting her gaze to meet his tearful eyes. "Where do you live?" "I'll take you home," she asked gently. The boy sniffled, his wet eyes looking up at her, and gave a small nod. "My house, it's nearby." Dieu Han nodded back, wasting no time. She secured her baby snugly in the cloth against her chest, then bent down and carried the boy on her back. Step by step she trudged forward, her frail figure carrying two small children as they silently moved through the night. As they reached the gate of a house, the boy stirred slightly and murmured, "Dad!" Before Dieu Han could react, the door suddenly swung open, and a tall, slender man rushed out. "My son!" he called, his voice filled with worry, his eyes darting to the wounds on the boy's limbs. Without hesitation, he swiftly lifted the child from Dieu Han's back, carrying him into the yard with care. "What happened to you?" he asked urgently. The boy sniffled and mumbled, "I fell off my scooter. She saved me." At that moment, the man finally looked at Dieu Han. His expression flickered with surprise before quickly shifting to gratitude. "Thank you for helping my son," he said sincerely. Dieu Han simply nodded, checking the boy's bandages one last time before taking a step back. "It was nothing. I'm just glad he's okay." The man continued to study her, as if wanting to ask something but hesitated. Dieu Han understood. He didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but she didn't want to explain. Not because she was afraid, but because she was used to the wary gazes of strangers. She forced a small weary smile. After leading Lai Nin to retrieve his scooter from the accident site, she bowed her head slightly. "I'll be going now." Lai Nin didn't know, and could never have imagined, that the woman who had just saved his child had nowhere to call home. Dieu Han walked slowly along the red dirt road, her eyes fixed on a dilapidated bamboo hut standing alone in the middle of the wild forest. Stepping inside, she found it completely bare. The roof was riddled with holes, the bamboo walls had gaps where the panels had come loose, and the dirt floor was covered in dried leaves. But this was the only place she could take shelter. She carefully placed her baby in a corner, pulling a scarf over the child to keep warm, then set to work fixing up the place. She gathered fallen bamboo sticks and carefully wedged them into the gaps in the walls to block the wind. She propped up the loose door frame, using a sturdy branch as a makeshift latch. She picked up and tacked dried leaves and patched up the leaking roof, though she knew it would still drip when it rained. After some time, the hut looked a little less abandoned, at least enough to offer some protection from the elements. Holding her baby close, she whispered softly, "We have a home now." But hunger quickly pulled her back to reality. She left the hut and walked along the edge of the forest, searching for food. Suddenly, she spotted a lemon bush heavy with ripe fruit, the plump green lemons hanging in clusters. She picked as many as she could, filling her basket while thinking, "I can sell these at the market." Along the way, she also gathered a few wild vegetables before heading back to the hut. The next morning, Dieu Han packed her basket of lemons, secured her baby snugly against her chest, and walked to the marketplace. She spread out a cloth on the ground, arranged the lemons neatly, and called out in a trembling voice, "Fresh lemons! Fresh lemons for sale!" First, no one paid attention, but little by little people started stopping by. Before long, she had sold nearly her entire basket. Clutching the small but precious earnings in her hand, she felt a glimmer of hope. On the way back, her stomach ached with hunger. She stopped by a small rice roll stall near the market and ordered a portion. As she ate, she gently rocked her baby, silent tears streaming down her face. Today she had a place to sleep, food to eat, and a little money to survive. The future remained uncertain, but at least now, she knew what she had to do to keep going. After selling all her lemons, Dieu Han clenched the small bills in her hand, feeling a slight sense of relief. Though it wasn't much, at least today, she had earned it through her own hard work. On her way back, hunger gnawed at her stomach. As she passed a small food stall near the market, the aroma of freshly steamed rice rolls made her stop in her tracks. She hesitated for a moment before deciding to spend a small portion of her earnings on a proper meal. Sitting down at a small table, she ordered a serving of rice rolls. The stall owner, noticing the weary young woman holding a baby, added an extra piece of meat to her plate without saying a word. Dieu Han ate slowly, savoring the warmth spreading through her empty stomach, easing some of her exhaustion. As she ate, she gently soothed her child, adjusting the cloth wrapped around the baby. Her eyes were quiet but filled with determination. After finishing her meal, she returned to the small hut, carefully placing her child down before picking up a lemon. She cut it in half, squeezed the juice into a cup of water, and slowly sipped the refreshing sourness, feeling a small flicker of hope rise within her. Looking around, the hut was still simple, barely a shelter, but at least it was a place to return to. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind rushed through, dark clouds gathering ominously in the sky. Within moments, heavy rain poured down, seeping through the gaps in the roof, wind howling through the fragile bamboo walls. Dieu Han curled up in a corner, holding her baby close, pulling a cloth over the child to shield them from the cold. Rainwater splashed inside, soaking the small mat in the corner. She shivered from the chill, but still clutched her child tightly against her chest. She looked up at the leaky roof and let out a silent sigh. This storm was a reminder that she and her baby still had no real place of safety. Outside, the relentless rain continued to pour. Inside the broken hut, a young mother held her child close, enduring the bitter cold. Yet, despite everything, the fire of resilience in her eyes had not. Fierce rain from last night had stopped. The morning sunlight seeped through the gaps in the hut's roof, casting a warm glow on Dieu Han's weary, yet resolute face. She stirred slightly, glancing down at her child, still sound asleep in her arms. Gently stroking the baby's cheek, she whispered, "The sun is out today. We'll have a better day, won't we?" The baby let out a soft murmur, half opened their eyes, then drifted back into peaceful slumber. Dieu Han sat up and stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. She knew she had to clean up the hut after the damp night. Grabbing a cloth, she made her way to the stream, knelt by the water's edge and scrubbed it thoroughly. The cool, clear stream shimmered under the sunlight, instantly refreshing her senses. Once she finished washing, she wrung out the cloth and carried it back to the hut to wipe everything down. The small hut was still damp, and the earthy ground felt cold. She carefully wiped every corner, smoothing out the sleeping area for her child. After tidying up, she stepped outside, gathering bricks and wooden logs to build a small stove just outside the door. Using large stones as a base, she constructed a sturdier cooking spot than before. With everything set, she returned inside, cradled her child, and lovingly nursed them, preparing herself for another long day of hard work. After finishing her preparations, Dieu Han wrapped her child against her chest and left the hut. She knew she had to reinforce their shelter. Otherwise, storms like last night's would only bring them more suffering. Gripping a machete, she followed a narrow path leading up the hill, where clusters of bamboo grew thick and strong. The sturdy, vibrant green stalks were exactly what she needed to rebuild the hut's floor and roof. She selected the most solid bamboo stalks and swung her blade with force, each strike echoing through the quiet surroundings. Once she had cut enough, she gathered the bamboo, hoisted it onto her shoulders, and carried it back with determined steps. Each step was heavy. Sweat drenched her back, dripping down her temples, but she pressed on without hesitation. When she reached the hut, she dropped the bamboo to the ground and leaned on her knees, panting heavily. Yet her eyes remained filled with determination. She used the machete to strip away smaller branches, then bent and flattened each stalk to prepare for flooring. Once the bamboo was ready, she tightly secured each piece to the ground with rope, gradually forming a sturdier, more stable floor. With each secured plank, she felt the hut growing stronger, no longer a damp, fragile shelter against the rain. Her hands burned from the friction against the bamboo, but she only paused to wipe the sweat from her face before continuing. Seeing the firm floor beneath her, she didn't stop. She headed back to the hill, this time to cut bundles of thatch grass for the roof. She bent down, gathering handfuls of the long grass, tying them into thick bundles. Lifting the heavy bundles onto her shoulders, she made her way back to the hut, sweat rolling down her skin, but her steps remained steady. Upon arriving, she didn't take a moment to rest. She immediately climbed onto the hut's frame, securing each thatch bundle over the leaking roof. The wind howled, causing her to sway, but she gripped the bamboo frame tightly, fastening each bundle one by one to ensure a sturdier, more protective cover. After hours of labor, the hut finally stood stronger than before, with no more gaps for rain to seep through. When everything was done, she sat down, exhaled deeply, and pulled out the last half of her instant noodles, chewing each bite slowly to regain her strength. She gazed at the hut, a small smile forming on her lips. At the very least, it was now a safer place for her and her child to stay. There were still many hardships ahead, but she knew there was still a path forward. After repairing the hut and filling her stomach with the last bit of instant noodles, Dieu Han wrapped her child against her chest and set out for the stream to gather snails. Hunger gnawed at her, but she had no choice. She needed to find more food today, and if she was lucky, she might even sell some to buy milk for her child. Following a narrow, overgrown path, she stepped into the cool stream, carefully scooping up layers of mud from the bottom with her hands. Under the gentle morning sunlight, the crystal-clear water reflected ripples as schools of fish lazily swam beneath the surface. She bent down, feeling along the edges of rocks, flipping over each stone to find the snails clinging tightly underneath. Her hands sank into the muddy water, searching through submerged roots until she uncovered plump, round snails one by one. She picked them up and dropped them into a bamboo tube she had brought along, slowly filling it with her harvest. Some snails were hidden deep in crevices between rocks, forcing her to dig harder, pushing away mud to get a clearer view. The icy water seeped into her skin, but she remained patient and persistent. Once she had gathered a decent amount, she sat down on a smooth stone, stretching her aching arms. Looking at the bamboo tube full of snails, she smiled faintly, relieved to have food for the day and a small hope of making some extra money. She emptied the snails to sort through them, setting aside the larger ones to sell while keeping the rest for a meal. With everything ready, she left the stream and walked toward the market, clutching the bamboo tube tightly, her step steadier than before. When she arrived, she hesitantly called out, "Fresh river snails. Anyone want to buy?" At first, no one paid attention, but as some curious shoppers stopped to take a look, the fresh, plump snails caught their interest. "These snails look great. I'll take some," one customer said. Her heart lifted as she made her first few sales, managing to sell a good portion of what she had collected. Clutching the hard-earned money in her hands, Dieu Han held it tightly, her heart brimming with hope. Today she had enough to buy milk for her child and prepare a proper meal. She knew now despair no longer consumed her. Leaving the market, she headed home, stopping by the hillside to gather lemongrass and chili, preparing for a hot, hearty meal after a long day of hard work. Back at the hut, Dieu Han gently placed her child down in their sleeping spot before quickly rolling up her sleeves to light the fire, preparing the first proper meal she had had in days. She poured the snails into a basket, carefully washing them clean. Then, with practiced hands, she smashed the lemongrass with a knife and finally chopped the chili, her movement swift and precise, as if she had done this countless times before. As the oil in the pan heated up, she tossed in the snails. A loud sizzling sound filled the air, and soon, the rich aroma of lemongrass and chili spread throughout the hut. Stirring the snails with her chopsticks, she felt a deep hunger rising within her, but she remained patient, carefully seasoning the dish to perfection. In no time, the steaming hot, spicy stir-fried snails were ready. She sat down inside the hut, placing her child beside her, gently blowing on each snail to cool it before taking a bite. The bold flavors, fragrant, spicy, and savory, filled her senses, momentarily washing away the exhaustion of the long day. As she ate, she spoke softly to her child, her voice tender and full of love. Looking around at the sturdy hut, the warm fire, and the simple yet satisfying meal before her, she felt a newfound sense of relief and peace. After finishing her meal, she held her child close, gently patting them, her gaze drifting toward the lush green hills in the distance. She knew that many hardships still lay ahead, but today was better than yesterday, and tomorrow, she would strive even harder. The early morning sunlight cast its golden glow over the lush green vegetable fields. Rows upon rows of lettuce, cauliflower, and kohlrabi stretched endlessly, covering a vast expanse of land. Dieu Han stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath, savoring the earthy scent mixed with the fresh aroma of vegetables. Today, she ventured deeper into the mountain village, determined to buy produce from the villagers and try her hand at selling in the market. She knew that relying solely on catching snails or foraging wouldn't improve her and her child's life. Without hesitation, she stepped toward the vegetable fields and bent down to harvest with her own hands. Each crisp head of lettuce was cut neatly at the base, its thick fresh leaves stacked into a large basket. She carefully lifted the firm, dense cauliflower heads with both hands and placed them in a bamboo crate. She wiped the kohlrabi bulbs clean with a cloth before neatly arranging them. As the sun climbed higher, sweat trickled down her forehead, but she pressed on, determined to gather enough vegetables for her first market trip. Once the baskets were filled to the brim, Dieu Han reached into her pocket and took out her last few coins, placing them carefully into the seller's hand. This money was all she had left from her last snail sale. As she handed it over, she knew she had nothing left. Everything now depended on this batch of produce. The woman counted the money, then glanced at her with a look of sympathy. "Try to sell them all, okay? If it goes well, come back for more next time." Dieu Han smiled, bowed in gratitude, then strapped her child to her chest, hoisted the heavy bamboo basket onto her back, and began the long journey to the market. The weight of the basket seemed to drag her down, but she took steady steps along the rugged red dirt road. In front of her was her child, behind her was their future. The journey from the vegetable field to the market was long, but she had no choice but to walk. Gravel crunched under her feet, and the sun grew harsher with every step, but she silently gritted her teeth and endured it. After what felt like an eternity, the market finally came into view. Dieu Han took a deep breath, scanning the area for a place to sit. She found a small shaded spot, gently set down the basket, dusted off her clothes and adjusted the cloth around her child. Carefully, she arranged the bundles of vegetables in front of her, straightening any bent leaves to make them look as fresh and appealing as possible. She hesitated for a moment before mustering the courage to call out softly, "Fresh vegetables here. Mountain-grown, clean and fresh. Anyone want to buy?" At first, no one paid her any attention. People were too busy with other stalls. Then a middle-aged woman stopped by, picked up a bundle of greens and asked, "Where are these vegetables from?" Dieu Han politely replied, "They're grown in the mountain village, completely fresh and clean." The woman nodded and bought some. Then another person stopped, followed by another. Gradually, her basket emptied faster than she had expected. Dieu Han busily handed out vegetables, collected money and packed orders. The nervousness from earlier faded as she focused on her work. By the time the last bundle was sold, she took a deep breath, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. She looked down at the money in her hands, eyes stinging with emotion, but her heart was filled with joy. Today, she had truly earned money from her own hard work. This wasn't scavenging. This wasn't begging. This was a fair trade. She labored and she was rewarded. Before leaving the market, she stopped by a small general store and carefully picked out vegetable seeds and a few farming tools. From now on, she would grow her own crops, no longer depending on anyone else. Today was only the first step, but she believed she could do it. And most importantly, she finally had enough money to buy rice and tofu, a proper meal after so many hard days. After a tiring morning selling at the market, Dieu Han clutched the bag of rice, tofu, and seeds tightly in her hands, quickening her pace on the way home. Today she had money, food, and most importantly, faith in herself. As soon as she reached her small hut, she gently laid her child down on the small mat, hurriedly removing the basket of vegetables and the bag of goods from her back. The baby was still sound asleep, rosy-cheeked under a thin blanket. Dieu Han looked at her child and smiled softly before immediately getting to work on cooking their first proper meal in days. She took out the rice and washed it in an old aluminum pot, rubbing the grains together as the cloudy water ran off. Droplets splashed onto her hands, cool and refreshing, bringing both a familiar and foreign feeling. How long had it been since she last cooked a real meal? Once the rice was clean, she poured in fresh water and set the pot on the stove. Next, she opened the package of tofu, carefully cutting it into even squares and neatly arranging them on a banana leaf. As the oil heated in the pan, she used a pair of bamboo chopsticks to gently place each piece of tofu in. The sizzling sound filled the air, and the rich aroma of frying tofu spread throughout the small space, warming her heart. She flipped each piece, watching as they slowly turned golden and crispy. She swallowed hard. Just the sight and smell made her mouth water. She didn't have many seasonings, but just having hot rice and crispy tofu was already a luxury compared to the past few days. While waiting for the tofu to finish cooking, she quickly tidied up the kitchen corner, gathering the dry firewood into a neat pile. When everything was ready, she took the steaming pot of rice off the stove, placed the plate of fried tofu beside it, and then turned to gently pick up her child. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper before slowly opening sleepy eyes to gaze up at her mother. Dieu Han gently stroked her child's back and whispered lovingly, "Wake up, my love. Today we have a good meal." She sat on the doorstep of the hut, holding her child in her lap, eating while gazing at the vast blue sky ahead. Each warm bite of rice, each crispy piece of tofu, it all carried the taste of determination and hard work. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she had truly built something for their life. The meal was simple, just rice and tofu, but to Dieu Han it was the most delicious meal she had had in a long time. She looked down at her child, who was smiling too, tiny hands waving in the air as if trying to catch the sunlight. Dieu Han smiled back, her eyes filled with warmth and love. After finishing their meal, she held her child close, gently patting their back to lull them to sleep, then sat quietly, gazing out at the empty land in front of the hut. Tomorrow, she would begin tilling the soil, planting the first rows of vegetables with her own hands. She would no longer just buy and resell vegetables. She would grow them, nurture them, and harvest them herself. She reached over, running her fingers over the small bag of seeds beside her, her heart brimming with determination. At dawn, as the sun peeked over the mountain range, Dieu Han was already awake, ready for a long day of labor. Today, she would begin cultivating the empty plot of land behind her hut, her first step toward self-sufficiency, no longer relying on buying vegetables to resell. She sat on the porch, cradling her child in her arms, gently nursing the baby while her determined eyes gazed toward the patch of land in the distance. That would be her garden, the future for both mother and child. Once the baby was asleep, she carefully laid them down on the bed, tucked the blanket snugly around them, then rolled up her sleeves and stepped outside. She placed a conical hat on her head, gripped the handle of her hoe firmly, and walked toward the barren land behind her hut. The ground was dry and covered in thick weeds, but she refused to be discouraged. Taking a deep breath, she channeled all her strength into her arms and struck the earth with her first swing of the hoe. The first strike was stiff. The soil was as hard as stone, but she didn't stop. Each swing became stronger and more confident, beads of sweat forming on her forehead. With every strike, the earth broke apart, and weeds were uprooted. She bent down, gathering the clumps of grass and piling them in a corner to be burned later. Her hands were covered in mud, her nails caked with dirt, but she didn't care. She just kept working tirelessly. She could feel the soil softening under her hoe, as if it was slowly becoming fertile, ready to welcome new seeds. After a while, neat rows of freshly tilled earth stretched before her. The sun climbed higher, drenching her back in sweat, but Dieu Han didn't allow herself to stop. She stepped inside to check on her child. Seeing that the baby was still sleeping peacefully, she went back to work. Beyond planting crops in the soil, she also wanted to build trellises for climbing plants like gourds, pumpkins, and loofahs. She started cutting long bamboo stalks and carried them back to the yard. Each stalk was trimmed and sharpened at one end for easier placement in the ground. She chopped additional crossbars and tied them securely with twine, forming a sturdy frame. Her small hands worked with determination, knotting each tie tightly to ensure the trellis was strong. Each time she secured a bamboo rod, she stepped back to inspect and adjust it. The sun began to set, casting long shadows, but she continued working diligently, perfecting every corner. When everything was finally complete, she stood still, admiring her hard work, a tired but contented smile appearing on her lips. The bamboo trellis was ready. Now all that was left was for the seeds to sprout and climb. With the garden prepared, Dieu Han took out the seed packets she had bought at the market and carefully opened each one. Tiny seeds fell into her palm, like little sparks of hope for the future. She crouched down, digging small holes with her hands, gently placing the seeds into the soil. Each time she covered a seed, she whispered softly, as if entrusting it with her hopes and dreams. "Grow well, grow fast so my child and I can have food to eat." After sowing, she carried a bucket of water and slowly sprinkled it over each row of soil. The water seeped into the earth, trickling through the cracks, cooling the garden. She stood back, hands on her hips, exhaling deeply as she admired the freshly planted rows. The sun was now low in the sky, casting a golden glow over her small garden, filling her heart with happiness. She returned to the hut, picked up her child, and brought them outside to sit under the bamboo trellis. Holding the baby close, she spoke softly about the seed she had just planted. The baby reached out, tiny fingers brushing against the bamboo strings as if wanting to be part of the work. Dieu Han hugged her child, kissed their forehead gently, and whispered, "I can do this. We will have a good life." Early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen, Dieu Han was startled awake by the faint cries of her child. She quickly sat up, leaning down to embrace the little one, whose body was burning hot in her arms. With trembling hands, she placed her palm on the child's forehead, feeling the intense heat radiating from it. Her baby had a fever. Fear gripped her heart as she held the child tighter, her hand gently stroking the small back. Alone in the vast wilderness with no one to help, panic surged within her. But the more afraid she felt, the more she reminded herself to stay calm and do something. She hurriedly wrapped her baby in a thin blanket and rushed up the hill to find mugwort leaves. Her bare feet moved quickly over the damp ground, the morning mist still clinging to the leaves. She searched frantically, silently praying to find the medicinal herb as soon as possible. Finally, among the low-hanging branches, she spotted clusters of fresh green mugwort. Overjoyed, Dieu Han reached out, plucking handfuls of the leaves and clutching them to her chest as if they were precious treasures before hurrying back to the hut. Upon returning home, she immediately boiled water, soaked a clean towel in the warm liquid, and wiped her child's body before placing a cooling patch on the little forehead. The baby's cries remained weak, the small eyes dull and unfocused, piercing her heart with sorrow. Dieu Han sat beside her child, holding the tiny hand, silently praying for a quick recovery. The sun continued to rise higher in the sky, but the worry in her heart refused to fade. Even after using mugwort leaves and fever patches, her child's condition did not improve. His body remained burning hot, and his breathing was labored. Dieu Han held him tightly, her heart in turmoil, as if it were on fire. What should she do? In this desolate place there was no one to help her. She couldn't let her child suffer any longer. Resolute, she decided to take him to the clinic. Rushing back into the hut, she grabbed an old cloth bag and pulled out the last of her money. Wrinkled, faded bills, just a few remaining. This was all she had earned from selling vegetables the day before. Looking at her son struggling to breathe in her arms, she hesitated no more. Even if she had to spend every last coin, even if it meant going hungry tomorrow, she had to save her child. She wrapped him tightly in a soft cloth, secured him on her back, and hurried off. The evening wind howled through the trees, rustling the leaves, but Dieu Han focused only on her son. He was so weak, his small head resting limply on her shoulder, his faint breaths brushing against her neck. She quickened her pace, yet every step felt painfully long. The rugged dirt road was littered with stones. Each time she stumbled on a small rock, she clutched the straps of the cloth carrier tighter, making sure he wouldn't be jolted. The farther she walked, the heavier her legs felt. But Dieu Han gritted her teeth, she refused to stop. Passing through a sparse forest, the clinic finally appeared in sight. She nearly burst through the doors, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Doctor, my son has a high fever, please help him." A nurse rushed over, her eyes quickly assessing the flushed, frail child before gently taking him from Dieu Han's arms. The doctor examined him swiftly before nodding. "He has a mild infection. He needs an injection immediately to reduce the fever." Hearing that, Dieu Han exhaled in relief. But as she pulled out her meager savings and handed it to the nurse, worry crept back in. Each crumpled bill placed on the table made her heart ache, because this was all she had left. Her child's weak cry rang out as the needle pricked his skin. Dieu Han turned away, biting her lip to keep from crying along with him. After the injection, the child, exhausted, fell into a deep sleep. The nurse reassured her gently. "He'll be fine. Don't worry, mother." Dieu Han nodded, but the weight in her heart did not ease. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, she carried her son out of the clinic. He slept soundly against her shoulder, his breathing steadier now, though his face still looked pale and drained. She held him close, as if trying to transfer all her warmth and strength to him. But as she walked the long road back, another worry crept into her mind. She had no money left. What would she do for food tomorrow? How would she provide for her child when everything ahead still seemed impossibly difficult? Dieu Han had no answers. She only knew one thing: she could not stop. She had to keep going. She had to be stronger. For her son, she would never fall. The sun had just risen above the mountains as Dieu Han secured her child on her back, carefully adjusting the cloth to keep him warm. Today, she had to venture deep into the forest to find food. If she was lucky, she might be able to gather some fruits to sell at the market for a little money. After leaving her child in the care of a kind woman in the village, she strapped the basket tightly to her back, put on her hat, and set off on her journey. Her feet moved quickly along the dusty trail. She lifted her gaze to the clear blue sky and took a deep breath. The cool forest breeze whispered through the trees, but her heart remained heavy with worries. She needed food. She needed money to survive. But would the deep forest have what she was looking for? Pushing through thick bushes, she carefully avoided sharp thorns. Suddenly, she spotted scattered cashew nuts on the ground, their dark brown shells covering the rich, creamy kernels inside. Something she had eaten before. She bent down, picking them up one by one, thinking to herself, "If I sell these cashews at the market, maybe I can make a little money." Opening her cloth bag, she carefully placed each nut inside, her eyes filled with hope. Walking further, she stopped in front of a small grove where banana trees stood close together. Clusters of green bananas hung in the air, some already ripening to a golden hue. Excited, she quickly grabbed her knife and hurried toward the largest tree. Standing on her toes, she reached out, feeling the soft texture of the ripe bananas. Without hesitation, she began cutting the bunches, sweat trickling down her forehead. Clenching her teeth, she used all her strength to pull the heavy bunch down. Thud! The bananas hit the ground, sending up a cloud of dust. She carefully gathered each bunch, arranging them neatly in her basket, her eyes shining with joy. Some of these bananas would be for food, while the rest would go to the market. After hours of effort, her basket was finally full of bananas and cashew nuts. It was much heavier than before, but she endured the weight without complaint. What she carried wasn't just fruit. It was hope, the very survival of her and her child. She walked slowly, sweat soaking through her back, her breath growing heavier. Stopping for a short rest, she pulled out a ripe banana and took a bite. The sweetness filled her throat, giving her a little energy. Once she regained her strength, she stood up and continued walking, her shadow stretching long on the trail leading back to the village. Upon reaching the village, Dieu Han picked up her child from the kind woman and thanked her with a small bunch of bananas. The baby rested his head against her chest, his tiny hands clutching the edge of her shirt. She held him tightly, breathing in his scent, then quietly made her way back to the hut. By nightfall, she lit a small fire in front of the house, preparing to roast the first batch of cashew nuts. The flickering flames cast shadows on her face, her eyes distant yet full of determination. The cashew shells darkened and crisped in the heat. She peeled them carefully, savoring their rich, nutty taste. Sitting by the fire, she glanced at her sleeping child, then at the basket of bananas beside her. She had done everything she could today. Tomorrow she would go to the market again to earn just a little more for her child. As the first light of dawn peeked over the mountain ridge, the golden rays of the sun gradually illuminated the sky. Dieu Han woke up, stretched gently, then turned to look at her son, still fast asleep. Carefully, she got out of bed, adjusted the cloth wrap for carrying her child, and began preparing for the new day's journey. Stepping out of the hut, she hoisted a heavy basket full of bananas onto her back. Though the weight pressed down on her shoulders, she quickened her steps. Morning markets were always crowded, and if she arrived late, she might not be able to sell her goods. The familiar red dirt road was rough and filled with stones, but she had long grown accustomed to hardship. As she neared the marketplace, the lively sounds of chatter, vendors calling out their wares, and the bustle of carts and motorbikes filled the air. Despite her fatigue, seeing the bustling market ahead gave her the motivation to keep moving forward. She found a small corner, set down her basket, and began calling out, "Fresh wild bananas! Perfect for eating or baking!" At first, no one paid her any attention, but she didn't give up, patiently inviting passers-by to take a look. All around her, other vendors were just as busy, each trying their best to sell their goods. The pressure weighed on her, but she forced herself to smile, greeting customers warmly. Finally, a woman stopped by, picking up a bunch of bananas to inspect. "Are these wild bananas? How much do they cost, dear?" "If you take more, I'll give you a good price, ma'am," Dieu Han responded politely. The woman smiled, nodded, and bought 2 bunches. Soon more customers began to approach. By midday, her basket was nearly empty. Wiping the sweat from her forehead, she looked at the money in her hands, feeling a deep sense of joy. It wasn't much, but it was the result of her hard work. Carefully tucking the money away, she quickly went to buy some food. Stopping by a small stall on the market's edge, she purchased 2 fragrant grilled corn cobs, one to eat now and one to save for her son. As she took her first bite, the sweet flavor spread across her tongue, making her realize just how hungry she had been since morning. After eating, she made her way to the stall selling baby chicks, deciding to buy a few to raise. She carefully selected the healthiest ones, placed them in a basket, and held it close to her chest. This was her first step toward securing a more stable food supply for the future. As the sun began to set, she hurried home. The evening breeze was cool, bringing a rare sense of peace after a long and exhausting day. Upon arriving, she placed the chicks in a makeshift coop and prepared food and water for them. Then she picked up her son and fed him a few bites of the grilled corn, her heart overflowing with happiness. The baby let out a soft giggle, his tiny hands clutching hers, a silent gesture of encouragement. Sitting on the porch, Dieu Han gazed at the small garden, slowly growing greener by the day. She whispered to herself, "I must work even harder so my son never." Dieu Han woke up early. Watching her child sleeping soundly, she gently stroked the soft hair and carefully laid the baby still on the small blanket. Today she had to build a chicken coop. Otherwise, the little chicks would have no safe shelter. She picked up a knife and walked toward the bamboo grove, where tall and densely packed bamboo stalks stood. To build a sturdy coop, she had to select straight bamboo stalks, not too old yet not too young, so they would be easier to weave. Standing before the grove, she raised the knife, examined the stalks carefully, then struck down forcefully. The first chop echoed sharply, but the tough bamboo required multiple strikes to cut through. Bamboo sap oozed out, sticking to her hands, but she paid no mind, focusing solely on cutting. As the first bamboo stalk fell, she quickly dragged it out of the thicket to prevent it from tangling with the others. Then she moved on to the second, then the third. With each chop, her arms grew more fatigued, yet she pressed on, ensuring each strike was firm and precise. Once she had cut enough bamboo, she took her knife and carefully stripped away the sharp branches to prevent injuries during transport. The long, heavy bamboo stalks lay before her. She bent down, tied them into bundles, then placed the carrying pole over her shoulders. Her shirt was soaked with sweat, and every step on the way home felt as if she were dragging her entire body forward. Occasionally, she had to set the bamboo down, gently massaging her aching shoulders before continuing. When she finally reached home, she dropped the pole onto the ground, panting heavily but not stopping for long. She picked up the knife again, shaving each bamboo stalk, peeling off the outer layer, and splitting them into neat, slender strips. Her hands began to sting as the sharp bamboo edges scraped against her skin, but she only glanced at them briefly before continuing her work. Next, she dug holes and planted the bamboo posts to form the coop's frame. Each shovel strike sent dirt flying onto her clothes. She pressed the posts deep into the ground with all her strength, then tied them tightly with rope to keep the structure stable. Smaller bamboo strips were then woven together, forming sturdy walls for the coop. Once the frame was completed, she gathered large bundles of dried grass and spread them over the roof to provide shade and protection from the rain. Climbing up, she secured each layer of grass to the bamboo frame, carefully adjusting them to prevent the wind from blowing them away. Just then, a loud cry came from the hut. Dieu Han quickly climbed down and ran inside to soothe her baby. Holding the child close to her chest, she gently patted and comforted the little one while continuing to finish her work. Her small hands moved swiftly, tying ropes and adjusting each panel of the coop. By the time the chicken coop was finally completed, the sun had already begun to set. She carried the little chicks inside, watching them chirp and peck at the grains with a deep, indescribable sense of joy. Though exhausted, she knew she had done what was necessary. A long, tiring day had passed, but life would go on, and tomorrow she would have to keep going. In the soft morning sunlight, Dieu Han stepped out of the house, carrying her child in a sling against her chest, and headed toward the coconut grove. Today, she decided to harvest coconuts to sell at the market, hoping to earn a little extra money to cover expenses. The winding red dirt path led into the grove, flanked by overgrown wild grass, with streaks of sunlight filtering through the towering coconut leaves. With steady yet gentle steps, she ventured deeper into the forest. The sight of the tall coconut trees, heavy with clusters of fruit, filled her with excitement. She placed her child in a safe spot, tugged the cloth snugly around the baby to keep warm, and then picked up her knife, making her way to the nearest tree. Running her hands over the coconuts, she carefully selected the large, fresh green ones. The sharp blade sliced cleanly through the stems, sending each coconut dropping onto the soft ground, rolling a few times before she gathered them into her basket. After collecting over a dozen coconuts, she paused for a moment, picked one and chopped off the top with her knife. Bringing it to her lips, she took a sip. The cool, sweet water spread through her mouth, refreshing her in the sweltering heat. Finishing her drink, she resumed picking until her basket was full. Her steps became heavier under the weight of the coconuts on her back, yet she persisted, making her way toward the forest's edge, where the road to the market awaited. On the way, she stopped at a small roadside shop and offered to sell some coconuts. The shop owner tried one, found the water delicious, and bought a few. Dieu Han gladly accepted the money, carefully tucking it away before continuing her journey. Arriving at the temporary roadside market, she spread out a small cloth, neatly arranging the coconuts before sitting down to wait for customers. People passed by, some stopped to buy, others glanced at her goods before continuing on their way. She gently called out to potential buyers, her warm smile never fading. Slowly, her basket emptied, replaced by small bills she carefully tucked into her pocket. By midday, almost all the coconuts had been sold. She stood up, stretched briefly, and packed up her belongings. Though the money she earned wasn't much, it was enough to buy some rice and a bit of food for her child. On the way home, she stopped by a small shop to pick up a few necessities before leisurely making her way back to her humble hut. Today had been a successful day of earning a living. Though exhausted, she felt relieved knowing she had a little more to get by. The road ahead was still long, but Dieu Han refused to let herself feel discouraged. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she believed she would overcome them. Dieu Han sat on a bamboo mat, cradling her child in her arms, soothing the baby with gentle whispers. The little one stirred, eyes half closed but unwilling to sleep. She rocked softly, patting the baby's back. After a while, the infant began to fuss, and she quickly loosened her blouse to nurse. Her slender fingers gently stroked the baby's soft, wispy hair, bringing her a small sense of peace. Once the baby was full, she carefully laid the child on a small blanket, tucking the edges over the tiny belly to keep warm. Ensuring the baby was sleeping soundly, Dieu Han grabbed a small basket, wrapped herself in a scarf, and followed the narrow footpath to the lotus pond. In the morning sunlight, the lotus flowers bloomed beautifully, their pink petals rising above the water, releasing a delicate fragrance. She waded in, the water reaching her knees, moving cautiously to avoid stirring up the mud beneath her feet. Choosing the freshest blossoms, she skillfully plucked each stem and arranged them neatly in her basket. Before long, the basket was full. She lifted it out of the water, let the excess drip off, and made her way home. Back at the hut, she emptied the lotus flowers into a large basin, carefully rinsing each petal before soaking them in water to keep them fresh. Once finished, she took a brief rest before heading to the stream to catch fish. She carried a woven bamboo trap to a shallow section of the stream, where the muddy water and dense aquatic plants provided a perfect hiding place for fish. Stepping in, she felt the soft mud between her toes, gauging the depth before slowly lowering the trap into the water. With both hands gripping firmly, she moved it carefully, eyes sharp for any movement. Suddenly, a strong splash startled her. She quickly lifted the trap. Inside was a large carp, flailing helplessly. Swiftly, she reached in, grabbed its slippery body, and tossed it onto the bank. She tried a few more times and managed to catch another fish. Her hands were covered in mud as she wiped her face and let out a relieved sigh. That was enough. Tonight, she and her child would have a good meal. Back home, she quickly lit the stove. The charcoal caught fire, sending wisps of smoke curling beneath the thatched roof. She carefully scaled and gutted the fish, washing them thoroughly. Tomatoes, scallions, lemongrass, and some sour greens were chopped and arranged on a bamboo tray. She placed a pot of water over the fire, added the fish with a pinch of salt, and waited for it to boil before tossing in the tomatoes, lemongrass, and a handful of yellow sesbania flowers. The aroma filled the air as the soup simmered. She scooped up a spoonful and tasted it. The perfect balance of sour and sweet spread across her tongue. Satisfied, she smiled. As the soup finished cooking, she prepared a bowl of steaming rice, pouring a bit of the flavorful broth over it. Carrying her baby to the front porch, she ate while chatting softly with the child. Dieu Han strode toward the sugarcane field, a machete strapped across her back, and a woven basket ready for harvesting. The towering stalks swayed in the breeze, whispering against one another, casting shadows that blocked out the sunlight. She paused, scanning the field, selecting the mature stalks, firm, slightly dry on the outside. Gripping the handle of her machete tightly, she swung with precision. The sharp blade sliced cleanly through the cane, producing a crisp snapping sound. One strike, then another, and the cane fell. Quickly, she stripped the leaves, trimmed both ends, and gathered the stalks into neat bundles. One by one, the rows of sugarcane were cut down. Sweat trickled down her forehead, but she didn't stop. Just then, she felt her child stir in the sling. She paused, walked to a small clearing, laid out a red cloth, and gently placed the baby down. After soothing the little one for a moment, she returned to her work. Sitting down on the ground, she drew her knife and began peeling the tough outer layers of the sugarcane. Strips of fibrous husk fell away, revealing the fresh, juicy white flesh inside. She snapped off a small piece and bit into it. The burst of sweetness spread through her throat, washing away her fatigue. Taking advantage of the short break, she bundled the peeled stalks neatly into her basket, organizing them for transport. Once everything was ready, she checked on her child. The baby was still peacefully asleep. Bending down, she kissed the little forehead, then carefully secured the child in the sling across her chest. Hoisting the heavy bundle of sugarcane onto her back, she felt the weight press down on her shoulders. Her steps were slow and heavy, but she pressed forward, making her way home. Upon arriving, she laid the baby in bed, nursed the child, then hurried to the porch to continue processing the sugarcane. Her hands moved swiftly, chopping each stalk into smaller sections and packing them into plastic bags for the market. When the work was finally done, she let out a deep breath, dusted off her clothes, and adjusted her basket. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Dieu Han secured her child in the sling once more, lifted the heavy load of sugarcane onto her back, and set off for the market. Rather than waiting at a stall, she moved from vendor to vendor, approaching people with a warm smile. "Ma'am, I have fresh sugarcane, harvested this morning. Would you like to take a look? Sister, this sugarcane is really sweet. I'll give you a good price if you want some for your stall." But not everyone was interested. Some waved her away, others glanced briefly before shaking their heads. Still, she remained undeterred, weaving her way through the rows of vendors. At a sugarcane juice stall, the owner took a small piece, chewed on it, and nodded approvingly. "It's sweet." She bought the entire bundle. Dieu Han beamed, grateful for the large sale, and continued seeking out more customers. She moved tirelessly from one stall to the next, and before she knew it, most of her sugarcane was gone. Counting the small bills she had earned, she sighed in relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a few necessities. Gathering her belongings, she secured her child once more, and made her way home under the fading light of the setting sun. Though exhausted, her heart felt light. Tomorrow would bring more struggles, but at least today she had done her best. After a night of rest, Dieu Han began her new day with work in the garden. Stepping out onto the porch, she opened the basket of seeds she had dried the day before. Carefully selecting the largest, firmest loofah seeds, she set them aside. Then she grabbed a bucket, took a small hoe, and headed to the garden to begin tilling the soil. The earth, still damp from the recent rain, was softer but also sticky, making the work more challenging. She put her strength into each stroke of the hoe, forming neat, even rows. Once finished, she gently placed the seeds into the soil, covering them carefully before watering to ensure the earth absorbed the moisture evenly. As she was focused on her task, a sudden burst of barking echoed from the pond's edge. Startled, she quickly turned and ran toward the noise. What she saw made her freeze. A small golden-furred dog was trapped in a tangle of vines and thick mud near the water's edge. It struggled desperately to free itself, but the more it thrashed, the tighter the vines wrapped around its legs. Its eyes were filled with panic as it whimpered and barked for help. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, though the muddy ground made each step slow and difficult. Kneeling beside the dog, she carefully untangled the vines wrapped tightly around its legs. The dog flinched, trying to pull away, but it was stuck. She spoke to it softly, her hands working steadily to free it. "Easy now, don't be scared, almost done." After a few minutes of effort, she finally freed the little dog. It trembled, looking up at her with eyes full of gratitude. She placed it gently on the ground, expecting it to run off, but instead it followed her. Back at home, she scooped some leftover rice and mixed it with a bit of dried fish from the kitchen, setting the bowl down in front of the dog. It sniffed the food briefly before devouring it hungrily, as if it hadn't eaten in days. Sitting beside it, Dieu Han smiled. She didn't know where it had come from or if it had an owner, but it seemed in no hurry to leave. It looked like she had just gained a new friend. Dieu Han returned home after a long morning of hard work. She gently placed her baby down on the red mat, letting the little one sleep peacefully in the quiet space of their small hut. Watching her child rest so soundly, she smiled before quickly preparing for her next task. She stepped into the garden, where the pepper vines were ready for harvest. Running her fingers lightly over the clusters of green peppercorns, she carefully picked the ripe ones, gathering them by the handful and placing them into her basket. The sun blazed overhead, beads of sweat forming on her forehead, but she remained persistent. Just then her baby woke up, crying softly. She hurried inside, cradled the child in her arms and soothed them. After nursing, she placed the baby in the cradle and went back to finish her work. Returning to the porch, she poured the freshly picked pepper onto a large tray, sifting through it carefully with both hands, separating the hollow seeds from the good ones. It was meticulous work, but she had done it countless times before. Once finished, she spread the pepper evenly on a large bamboo tray and set it out under the sun to dry. With the garden work done, she turned to the seedbed where she had planted crops a few days earlier. The soil was dry, so she carried a bucket of water and carefully watered each row. As she bent down to tend to the plants, she suddenly noticed a snake slithering along the edge of the garden. Her heart pounded and she held her breath, watching closely. Slowly, she took a few steps back and grabbed a long branch, waving it gently to drive the snake away. Luckily, it slithered off into the bushes, leaving her still catching her breath. After a long day of non-stop labor, she gathered the sun-dried pepper into her basket and set off for the market to sell it. She went straight to the buyer, emptied the pepper onto the scale, and received her well-earned payment. The weight in her heart lightened just a little. On her way home, she stopped in front of a children's clothing store. She stood there for a moment, then decided to step inside. Browsing through the tiny outfits, she smiled softly. It had been so long since she could buy something nice for her child. When she got home, she immediately dressed her baby in the new clothes, then went to the kitchen to prepare fresh porridge. Stirring the pot, she thought about her plans ahead. Life was still full of challenges, but little by little, she was building a better future for the two of them. Dieu Han stood in front of her house, holding her baby in her arms, quietly watching as the local health official carefully sprayed mosquito repellent around the porch, the garden, and even the chicken coop. Thin white mist drifted through the air, clinging to the cracks in the bamboo walls of the small house. She took a step back, shielding her baby, waiting for the fumes to fade before going back inside. Once it was done, she quickly gathered her things, wrapped her baby securely in the sling across her chest, and stepped out onto the red dirt path, heading toward the community health center. Today was vaccination day. She knew it would hurt, but it was something she had to do. While waiting, she gently comforted her baby, softly stroking the fine hairs on the child's head. When it was their turn, she held the baby tightly as the nurse administered the shot into the tiny arm. The baby cried out, and Dieu Han whispered gently, soothing the child with quiet words. Soon the crying stopped, and the baby nestled into her chest, seeking warmth. On the way back, she stopped by the home of an elderly woman in the village, someone she had arranged to watch the baby for a while. The woman looked at the child, reached out to take the baby, and gave a small nod. Dieu Han gently laid her child down, whispered a few instructions, her eyes revealing a quiet nervousness. Today, after many years apart, she was going to visit her parents. Back home, she changed into her traditional dress, tightened the sash around her waist, and stepped out the door. Her bare feet moved across the familiar footpaths that wound through the hills. The grass and trees were still as green as she remembered, but her heart felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. In the distance, her parents' old house appeared behind a row of trees, barely visible under the soft morning sunlight. Taking a deep breath, she walked faster, emotions swelling inside her, feelings she couldn't quite name. Under the harsh midday sun, Dieu Han carefully walked along the dirt path leading to her parents' home. She wore her traditional brocade dress, and her steps quickened as the old house came into view. It had been a long time since she last returned. She didn't know if her parents were still angry with her. As she reached the gate, she saw her father sitting on the front steps, his eyes stern, gazing off into the distance. Her grandmother sat inside, quietly sipping tea. Dieu Han greeted them, but there was no warm welcome. Silently, she made her way into the kitchen, scooped a bowl of rice, rinsed it, and set a pot of porridge on the stove. The fire crackled as smoke drifted faintly through the air. She stirred the pot with care, adding a pinch of salt and a handful of greens. She brought the steaming bowl to her grandmother and gently placed it in front of her. But the old woman only glanced at it, then suddenly knocked it over. The porridge spilled onto the floor, and Dieu Han's hand froze midair. Her grandmother was angry, scolding her for not coming home for so long, but how could she know everything Dieu Han had been through? Biting her lip, Dieu Han silently knelt and cleaned up the mess without a word. She returned to the kitchen and ladled another bowl, this one for her father. They sat across from each other in silence. No conversation, only the sound of spoons clinking against bowls and the wind whistling through the wooden shutters. When they finished eating, she stood up and stepped into the garden. By the pond, a group of geese waddled noisily. Dieu Han grabbed handfuls of feed and scattered it over the water. The geese clamored, honking loudly as they fought over the food. Farm work never stopped. She moved on to harvesting cashew nuts, dropping each one into her basket with a soft thud. The ripe golden fruit smelled sweet, stirring childhood memories, back when she still lived at home, untouched by life's harsh turns. After collecting the cashews, she headed to the pigsty, slicing banana stalks into thin strips, mixing them with bran to cook feed for the pigs. She poured water into a large pot and lit the fire. The heat from the stove rose sharply, and sweat formed on her brow, but she stayed focused, stirring the mixture carefully to keep it from burning. Once everything seemed settled, she decided to head into the forest to gather medicinal leaves, hoping to earn a bit of money. With a basket on her back, Dieu Han moved through the dense trees, her hands swiftly picking the herbs she recognized. On her way back, she suddenly caught sight of a familiar figure, her ex-husband. Her steps faltered, heart pounding. He was standing in the front yard, speaking loudly to her father. Dieu Han quickened her pace. By the time she reached the gate, he had turned to face her, his eyes full of anger. He launched into a story, accusing her of terrible things, claiming she had been cast out for her wrongdoings. Her father didn't wait for an explanation, just the sight of the man was enough to enrage him. He threw her clothes into the yard and growled, "You are no longer my daughter. Leave. Don't come back." Dieu Han stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes. She couldn't speak, couldn't defend herself. Slowly, she picked up her scattered belongings and silently placed a small bundle of money, her last savings, into her father's hand. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away. Her footsteps were heavy, and there was no place left to return to, except her humble makeshift home. Carrying her baby, Dieu Han stepped out of the house and headed toward the distant kapok forest. She walked slowly, carefully placing each step, mindful not to disturb the child sleeping peacefully in the sling. Overhead, the tall kapok trees swayed gently, their golden ripe pods hanging low, ready for harvest. She paused, set down her basket, and picked up a long pole, using it to knock down the fluffy pods. One by one, the pods dropped with soft thuds. She bent down to gather them, her hands quickly peeling away the outer shells to reveal the pure white cotton inside. She packed the cotton into her basket, occasionally wiping sweat from her brow. The forest breeze was cool, but her heart felt heavy. A sense of unease crept in, like someone was silently watching her every move. In the distance, hidden behind the trees, a shadow moved. His eyes glinted with malice as he watched her. Dieu Han's ex-husband had found where she lived. He stood behind a tree trunk, gaze cold and calculating. Unaware of the danger lurking nearby, Dieu Han continued harvesting, carefully filling the basket with cotton. As she looked up, she suddenly shivered, as if someone had just slipped out of sight. She glanced around, alert, but saw nothing out of place. Thinking it was just her imagination, she hoisted the basket onto her back, adjusted the baby in the sling, and began the walk home. From afar, her ex-husband followed silently. His footsteps light on the earth, his eyes filled with rage. He wasn't ready to confront her yet. He was waiting for the right moment. Back home, Dieu Han laid her baby down on the mat and began cutting fabric to stuff with the kapok and make pillows. Focused on her stitching, she didn't realize someone had slipped inside. Her ex-husband crept around the house, rummaging through her things. When he found the pouch of money hidden at the bottom of a chest, he shoved it into his pocket. She turned around and froze. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He smirked, then ran for the door. She lunged to grab the money, but he was stronger. He shoved her to the ground. Clutching her stomach in pain, she could only watch as he stuffed the pouch into his shirt. Not stopping there, he kicked over some of her belongings in a fit of rage. Then he slammed the door shut and locked it from the outside. "Stay in there and cry," he growled before stepping onto the porch, stretching out with a bottle of liquor in hand. Holding her baby tightly, Dieu Han's mind raced. She couldn't stay trapped. She scanned the room and remembered the bamboo floorboards. One of them could be lifted. Wasting no time, she gently raised a slat, careful not to make a sound. The night was cold, the wind cutting through the darkness. She slipped out, secured her baby to her back, and crept away. Her figure slowly disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by the hazy road ahead. Back at the house, her ex-husband stumbled inside, calling out, but no one answered. Enraged, he kicked over pots and pans, smashed a stack of bowls, and stormed into the yard. He yanked up rows of vegetables she had planted, stomping the roots into the dirt. In a drunken rage, he tore through the firewood pile, then flipped the small table she used for cooking. Finally, he collapsed on the ground, muttering curses. "Trying to run from me? Let's see how far you get," he sneered, his bloodshot eyes blazing with anger. Meanwhile, Dieu Han pressed forward, her feet stumbling along the rough dirt path. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to get far away from there. Her baby stirred in the sling, and she gently patted the child's back, trying to calm both of them. The cold night wind stung her skin, and her body trembled with exhaustion and hunger. Unable to continue, she stopped beneath a large tree by the roadside, pulled out a thin cloth to cover her baby, and looked around. No lights, no houses in sight. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, leaning back against the tree. She took the last piece of bread from her bag, broke off a small bit, and put it in her mouth, but it was so dry she could barely swallow. Holding her baby close, her eyes slowly grew heavy. Darkness blanketed the world around them, and the road ahead remained uncertain. But would life really let her stay in this darkness forever? Stay tuned to find out what happens next in Dieu Han's story.
Cuộc đời là một con đường dài, nơi giấc mơ hòa tan thực tại. Buồng bước chân ta bắt xây dần bức tranh vẽ lên thử thách lớn. Những nỗi đau, niềm vui tạm bợ tạo nên muôn màu sắc cuộc đời. Dù cuộc sống đôi khi thử thách, những đam mê vẫn trực trào cháy. Hãy sống với đam mê cháy bỏng, đừng chờ đợi mà hãy thực hiện những khoảnh khắc quý giá lắm, đừng để thời gian trôi xa. Giữa bộn bề cuộc sống tìm chút bình yên, trong trái tim lặng lẽ nơi còn phiền. Giọt sương mai đọng trên lá xanh, đem lại niềm vui cuộc sống vắng tanh. Ánh sáng mặt trời dọi qua mây, dù mưa giông vẫn đang đong đầy, trong lòng chứa đầy hy vọng. ngày mai sáng tươi chờ đợi ta. Bước đi trên con đường đầy hoa, dẫu khó khăn không lùi bước, trong tim giữ trọn niềm tin,